Rising Storm 2 Vietnam is an all-new 32 vs 32 combat game that's very much like Battlefield. It's a shooting game set in the Vietnam War, which is an interesting era that's not really covered very much in gaming. Now, this is 100% a multiplayer game. There is no campaign or anything like that to play solo. There is some like training missions that'll teach you the game, but there's really nothing that's outside of the actual main multiplayer of the game. Basically, it's a 32 on 32 player combat, much like Battlefield, in which you can play as either the US Marine Corps, the US Army, the Australian Army, the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese Army. There's 4 different modes that you can play the game in, and a 4th one that encompasses all the earlier 3. So there's Skirmish, Supremacy, Territory, and then the Campaign, which incorporates all of them. Skirmish is much more like a team deathmatch, while Supremacy plays a little bit more like what you would find in a Conquest mode in Battlefield. There's different points you have to take. However, you have to capture them in order depending on which ones connect, that then contribute back to your main score for your team. And then Territory, there's 2 teams, one's attacker and one's defender, and you fight for control of different points. And the most exciting mode, I think, is the Campaign mode. Basically, it incorporates the Supremacy and Territory mechanics. So instead of having just a single map you're playing on a large campaign that can take over multiple hours. Basically, you play as either the South or the North, and then your team votes on different objectives to attack or defend. And then depending on which place you attack or defend, you get different maps and battles based on either Supremacy or Territory. Capturing territories is very important as it contributes to your overall victory condition to actually winning the overall campaign. And it also has an interesting system because if you lose a bunch of people on one map or you die a bunch, it can contribute to future battles by lowering how much points you have going into the next battle. It's an interesting and cool system that really creates an overarching story to your multiplayer session. The gameplay is very different from your average shooter, and the game very much tells you that up front with a giant message that states quite frankly that one shot can kill you very easily, and it doesn't even need to be a sniper rifle. Somebody just placing a really well and good shot with a simple rifle can kill you, or a simple SMG. These things can have devastating effects on your gameplay, and it really emphasizes a much more slower and tactical gameplay because trying to run and gun is just not feasible in this. Combat is also at a larger distance oftentimes than what you'd find in a traditional shooter, and you'll be doing things like hiding behind buildings and trying to peek around the sides to look around because exposing yourself is very dangerous, and you really want to set yourself up in good spots, good cover, because otherwise you can just get wrecked easily by somebody you don't even see who's hidden somewhere. Combat also takes place at much larger ranges than what you'd find in other shooting games, which really emphasizes this much more strategic gameplay, taking cover and finding defensive position. There's a heavy emphasis in this game on teamwork, working together, as lone wolfing it just does not work very well in this game at all. You need to work together in position and push points together as a team. You can't just run in there by yourself or you're going to get mowed down. You need to use things like suppressive fire with machine guns because one bullet, again, can kill anyone very easily. You need to use things like the assault kind of classes, smoke grenades, to create opportunities for your team to position and move into a point. And you also have a commander who can try and organize things by ordering squads to different objectives, but also most importantly, they can do things like calling in artillery barrages or calling in airstrikes with napalm and other things like that. Different factions also get different things, like the North Vietnamese can dig tunnels for mobile spawning points, the Americans can fly in with helicopters and bomb points or transport people around. It overall creates a very unique and interesting style of gameplay that really just isn't seen that often in shooter games, that actively encourages teamwork and using voice chat to communicate. And that's very interesting and really rewarding in many ways when it works out well. But it's also a double-edged sword because if you have a really bad team, there's just no hope for you. You're going to get completely stomped out, and it's not going to be any fun at all. If there is something to complain about in Rising Storm, it's definitely the fact that this game feels very clunky. Just doing simple things like moving around or shooting just feels awkward and clunky, and it was really hard to get used to this game during the first couple hours of playing it because things just didn't work out very well, and it felt very clunky and indie-like. From a graphics perspective, this game just has not aged very well at all for its short life. It just doesn't look very pretty at all. It's very crude. Textures look weird. Sometimes plants and vegetation and trees and buildings that you run into on the maps just don't look quite right. It's just not the best looking game at all. The guns also look a bit strange as well. From a sound perspective, the game does a really good job. It actually feels very much like you're in there. It's very immersive. Hearing the gunshots and hearing the artillery strikes and the napalm screaming in, that stuff is fantastic. Overall, Rising Storm 2 Vietnam gets a 7 out of 10. It's a pretty decent game that could be a lot better with just some minor tweaks here and there. It's very much a rough game with rough edges and clunky mechanics, and things just don't always work out particularly well in the controls section. But none of that really holds it back from being a pretty fun game. It's the small things like the lack of a reticle, having to go down in iron sights to actually shoot people because just simply spraying around just does not work at all because there's no reticle and there's no aiming at all. Simple things like that and the mechanics behind how you run, allowing you to crouch run and do different things to take behind cover, these all kind of build up to create a very unique and tactical experience that just isn't really seen in other games. And I would recommend it because I do think it's a unique experience that is a lot of fun, despite the clunkiness.